So the number one story we're going to roll with is this stuff from Justin Trudeau. So we're going to play this clip in a second. This is Justin Trudeau being asked about like the Meghan Harry interview, and you just have to listen to what he says in this interview about basically Parliament being built on systemic racism and colonialism, and just having zero constitutional concerns about the civil liberties at this point revolving on COVID. And this is just a moral abomination for our Prime Minister. So let's roll this clip and just try and keep your head not exploding.
I know you don't want to get involved in a constitutional debate. I know you don't want to comment on the royal family. But I would like to ask you, how do you reconcile your support for the monarchy with your stated desire to dismantle the legacy of colonialism in this country?
There are many institutions that we have in this country, including that big building right across the street from us, Parliament, that has and is built around a system of colonialism, of discrimination, of systemic racism in all of our institutions. People want to later talk about constitutional change and shifting our system of government. That's fine, and they can have those conversations. But right now, I'm not having those conversations.
All right, let's start with the latter half of that interview, because that's by far the most important part, where he's just not worried about the constitutional aspects at this moment. Now, in the midst of a pandemic, I can excuse this response in the first week, up to the first month, okay? You can say, listen, we're dealing with a crisis. Like, there could be a certain crisis, let's say an asteroid, breaks apart and fragments of it have hit parts of Canada, and there's just absolute chaos, and we just need to streamline a response, and we're nationalizing different industries and taking over because people are dying and we have to get the fires out. Like, you could say at that point, if I'm Prime Minister, hypothetically, guys, I'm not worried about the constitutional thing right now. There's lives on the line. We're pushing forward, okay? You get that in terms of emergency. Okay, so you have a pandemic. You don't really know. The WHO's declared a pandemic. You could say, for the first week, I don't think it's right. I don't think it's ever right to ignore the constitutional things around COVID. But for the first week, I can understand you're saying, listen, guys, we're just the primary focus of the government right now. We have to spend all our mental energy on the best ways to mitigate this pandemic and the best responses. And that's all where energy's going. We're going to have to worry about the externalities of what we're doing. That's for a later date. I can excuse that. Okay, I can excuse that. I don't think it's the best mentality to take, but I can take that because on the first week, you can have a legitimate excuse in week one of a crisis of like, listen, we are just focused on just pushing straight forward to like the best result. We're trying to save lives, and we can't really worry about the externalities now. Now, after a week, I find it unbelievable that you didn't have time to reflect on the philosophical and constitutional externalities of what your policies are doing, right? But for about a month, you can get somewhat of a pass. After a week, I have heavy skepticism saying, yeah, you probably have time to reflect on the constitutional externalities of what you're doing. After a month, there's no more excuse, okay? You have, it's not that he's not just, it's, the thing is, he's just not thinking about it. Like, he could say, listen, we're thinking about it, but our primary focus is on saving lives. Like, that's not the right response, but that's at least somewhat understandable. If he was like, listen, we understand there's constitutional externalities and we're keeping that in mind, but our primary focus is saving Canadian lives. But we're 1 year in. We're not 1 month in. We're 1 year in. And he has not had time over the last year. There's not been a moment of downtime for Justin Trudeau, who takes more days off than anyone else on the planet, who goes off on vacation and he's off there in his little resorts and he's taking days off. And during one of his many days off, he has not had time to reflect on the constitutional externalities of what he's been doing during COVID. Not even, is this where we are now on the left? I ask this question seriously to, I guess, any left-wing people who still watch this show, or the lawyers who are left-wing who are being paid to is he going to say something about the Muslim Brotherhood in 15 minutes from now? So just hold on, right? Is this where you want to be, where your leader just doesn't worry about civil liberties concerns? Like imagine 9/11, right? In the wake of 9/11, how George Bush said, and the Patriot Act. Let's say it's September. Okay, it's probably, let's say it's October 2002. And George Bush is just not concerned at all about the constitutional impact of the Patriot Act. Do you think, if you're a left-wing person, you would accept that for a second? For 1 second, do you think anyone who claims to be liberal would accept George Bush saying that he is not concerned in the slightest, hasn't even thought about the constitutional implications of the Patriot Act? No, you know what? I can understand that on the first week, right? September 12th to September 18th, 2001. You can understand if George Bush is like, listen, we got to just do right now, we got to make sure there's no more terrorist groups, we got to find out who these guys are linked to, we just got to do some stuff because if there's another attack planned, right, if there's more terrorists, we got to learn where they are, is this the Taliban, is it Al-Qaeda, we got to find out if there are any more cells in the United States, and that is our primary focus, we're just going on that, we're trying to find, you know what, it's not the right thing to do, you should always be thinking about constitutional externalities in a free society. But for the first week after 9/11, you can say, okay, we can kind of understand how it was a crisis moment, lives are at stake, it can be excused, right? But once you get sort of past that, especially past a month after September 11th, it's the job of the president to start thinking of the constitutional externalities of the actions they take. Because as the leader of a country, when you start to do certain things, you start to throw certain rights and liberties, civil liberties out the window, it's very hard to put them back. So if you are supporting Justin Trudeau at this moment, you have to understand, or you have to at least take responsibility that you don't care about civil liberties. You don't. Your primary goal is the pandemic or something. And it's even a falsehood on that, because this is a guy who claims that there's more important things than worrying about constitutional externalities. However, this is the guy who has effed up every single aspect of the COVID recovery or the COVID plan. Now, let's take everything Dr. Theresa Tam, the WHO, and Anthony Fauci say as absolute gospel, okay? Let's just play this in a hypothetical game where Dr. Theresa Tam, Anthony Fauci, and WHO, and the Communist Party of China have not lied to us. They are the experts. They know best. They are our lords and saviors. Fauci, Tam, the dictators. Okay, let's just take that to be true, all right? Now let's look at how Justin Trudeau, who has spent no time thinking about the constitutional externalities of what we're doing because he's solely focused on Canada. No, it was 15 days to flatten the curve. We're approaching about 15 months to flatten the curve. And I go into this before, but we'll do it again. The theory behind flattening the curve was such. You're not going to actually reduce the amount of cases long term, but let's say this is the curve and this is the line. So the line here on the curve that I'm making here, that is the sort of line of resources we have, right? The curve is the amount of COVID cases. This is resources to handle them. COVID really becomes dangerous, right? We have the ability to sort of keep people alive with COVID, right? We have the respirators, we have the ventilators, we have the medicine to, the problem with COVID is it could be in for a long haul. People can get sick for a while. So what we need to flatten the curve is to keep the curve below the line where our resources can handle it and avoid mass death, right? This is the problem initially in Italy, right? What happened is the amount of cases exceeded the resources available to handle those cases in a 21st century medical technology way. And that's why you saw heavy death rates start to spike in Italy. What you need to do to flatten the curve is you need to flatten the curve, and then you use the time when you flatten the curve to increase resource capabilities to a higher level. You move that line up to a point where now if the curve peaks, it shouldn't exceed that line, and this gives you the ability to handle COVID going forward. That is the theory behind flattening the curve. Now, none of that was done because flattening the, it's literally impossible to play this mind game where everything Fauci and Tam said is true because it contradicts itself. There are way more contradictions in the Bible of Dr. Theresa Tam and Anthony Fauci than there are in the Bible and the Quran put together. But we're going to just pretend that they are almighty still. Hey, now we have Justin Trudeau, who overpaid by $100 million for those ventilator contracts, and he gave the ventilator contract to one of his friends who was a former Liberal MP who had started the company to produce the ventilators 1 week before he got the contract, and they took no other bids on the contract. It was a single source bid. They used emergency powers to say, we're not going to have different companies bid on who's going to make the ventilators and propose proposals. We're just going to give it to this one company because it's an emergency. That one company happens to be created just last week. Oh, and it just happens to be a friend of Justin Trudeau and a lifetime Liberal insider and former Liberal politician who just got that contract. Oh, and we overpaid $100 million for it? Oh, just a happy coincidence. But this guy was so focused on COVID and doing the right thing that he just doesn't have the time, has not had has not had more than 10 seconds of free time over the last year to think about the constitutional externalities of what he's done. Ridiculous. It's an absolutely ridiculous lie by Justin Trudeau, and it shows that he's an authoritarian. Like, if you're a Justin Trudeau supporter, I'm sorry, you're not a liberal. You can't call yourself a classical liberal, a philosophical liberal, a political liberal. You're a totalitarian. You're on the red team. That's what you are. You're on Team Red, you think he's handsome, and you think conservatives are mean, so you just vote based on your team. That's what you are. You have no principles to stand on. Prove me wrong. Now, let's go to the other part of this, right? The first part, which is, now, I like the fact that Justin Trudeau did not comment on the royals, although he kind of commented on the royals. You've seen the video I made about nuking the royal family. I hate the royal family because I hate talking about it. I think it's boring. There'll be no Meghan or Harry or Queen Elizabeth coverage on this show. I hate all of it. Yes, Prince Andrew is a pedophile. Load him into a catapult, fire him into the ocean. Okay. Now, in not saying this, the mealy-mouthed, ridiculous answer he gives is like, oh yes, we have systemic racist things right here. And he names Parliament as an example of colonialism and systemic racism. He says the Canadian Parliament is based off systemic racism. The Canadian Parliament, Canada, founded in 1867. 1793, we tried to pass the Act Against Slavery. Canada is like the only country founded by actual abolitionists. It's ridiculous to say that our structure was based off systemic racism. Now, am I going to say that the treatment of the Indigenous population has been perfectly fine? No, but we did not create the system. It's like, this is the now narrative of the left, right? It has shifted radically in my lifetime in the last 2 decades. It was, at one point, listen, there are problems and there's historical racism and Canada is not perfect, but by sort of correcting and apologizing for past, it helps us move forward, right? So no one in the 1990s really would have suggested seriously that Canada is founded on the concept of racism. A few radicals, but they would say Canada was founded, and a lot of the founders sort of ignored, other people, right? They might have ignored, Black and Indigenous voices, but it wasn't our founding. Like, Canada was not founded. Like, a lot of it was founded Canada kind of finally came together because a bunch of drunk Irishmen who were Civil War veterans were really pissed off at the British, so they kind of went to go invade Canada, and a couple hundred drunk Irishmen actually managed to break into Ontario, but they couldn't hold it because it's too big. And then we were like, okay, maybe we should form a country, and Britain was like, yeah, they should probably have a country so they can defend themselves in case a bunch of drunk, angry Irishmen come up and try and take over again. But there was a bunch of other stuff before that, the Charlottetown Conference. The point of Confederation was not to oppress the Blacks or the Indigenous people, right? It was to build a nation, right, that would be separate from America, right, and to create sort of the country of Canada. It started as a dominion, then you have the 1917. I've gone into all this, the history of how Canada becomes. It's a long, complicated process. But to say that Parliament is based on systemic racism, that's why we created a Parliament that represents the people. That was the whole point of creating Parliament, was to uphold the structures of white supremacy. People are just allowed to say this absolute gibberish and get away with it at this point. It's gone fully off the cliff. We've gone off the cliff on the left, where it's not, hey, listen, Canada has some sins in its past and we should work together with the Indigenous people to come to a reconciliation. No, it's Canada was based on the philosophy of evil. Canada is evil. Canada was established for the express purpose of racism. That was the primary founding principle, was we want to be racist, and by creating Parliament and having people elect their representatives to go and have regional representation by the people, the point of democracy is actually racism. Do you not see the communist infiltration here? Do you not see it? Do you not see the obvious Soviet propaganda that's leaked into our modern left? Where the actual foundations of our democracy, and this isn't the NDP, this is the Liberal, the allegedly centrist party, this is the leader, this isn't the Fringe, this is Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, has now put forward that the founding principle of Canada, the reason we have democracy is racism. Democracy is racism. That is the narrative they're trying to push. It is insane, and we just can't have it.